Hello and welcome to the Telegraph. I'm Dominic Nichols, the Associate Editor for Defence here. Delighted to be joined today by John Bolton, the US former National Security Advisor and former Ambassador to the United Nations. Mr. Bolton, good morning. Mr. Bolton, welcome to the Telegraph. Thank you very much for spending the time with us here. Now, Xi Jinping is in Moscow today. We hear this morning he has invited Vladimir Putin back to China later on this year. What would it mean for China's standing in the world if President Xi were to offer heavy weapons or sophisticated technology for Russia's war effort in Ukraine?
Well, to begin with, I think China's been supportive of Russia from the outset of this war 13 months ago. A lot of analysts in the West have said China is embarrassed by Russia. It's trying to separate itself from Russia. That's simply not true. They have been providing economic support, buying Russian oil and gas, facilitating movement of Russian finances through the Chinese system. The West has made a major point to say they don't want China to supply weapons, and China so far has said that it wouldn't. But there are a lot of ways to accomplish the same objective without actually shipping the weapons. Selling weapons to Belarus that then transfers them to Russia or to North Korea, providing components of weapon systems, if not the whole system. Simply providing fungible assets, money in particular, takes the pressure off Russia. I think when China and Russia both say this is an alliance with no limits, I think they mean it. That's the real problem for the West, no matter what happens in Ukraine.
Now, there's been a lot of talk about vital interests from the US point of view recently, Ron DeSantis' comment. Is Europe a vital interest for the United States, would you say? And have the actions by Europeans in the wake of this war shown that the US has sufficient military force in Europe to protect those interests?
Well, I think Ukraine is a vital interest for the United States. And in fact, it's kind of basic that since 1945, we've considered peace and security in Europe as a vital American interest. So when part of it is threatened in Ukraine, even though it's not a NATO member, other NATO members are affected. I thought Ron DeSantis' comment was very disappointing. I'm hoping it was purely political in nature and therefore can be revised. I don't think it's a reflection of where the bulk of the Republican Party is on support for Ukraine, but I think there is a continuing question about the resolve of some European countries and whether Putin can play on that lack of resolve to achieve politically what his forces have not been able to achieve militarily. There's a risk of that in the United States too. People forget that there are splits within the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. But I think this should be a wake-up call, and I think Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow makes it even clearer. The West has got to think in global terms for its own security. That a threat in Ukraine is one aspect, a threat to Taiwan is another aspect. And what we're all doing, what our military capabilities are, what our defense industrial base looks like, all should be on the table and I think will be in the United States in the 2024 election.
Now, in your December 2021 article entitled "Now is the Time for NATO to Stand Up to Russia," you called for an aggressive response to Moscow's build-up on the Ukraine border. How much more could and should NATO have done to deter Russia from invading Ukraine last February?
Well, I don't think President Biden did much to try and deter Russia. He said, in fact, on a number of occasions, he didn't think we could deter Russia. I think that's flatly wrong. I think, among other things, we could have imposed significant sanctions on Russia before the invasion. People said at the time, but that will just prompt Russia to invade. Well, they did, so how could it have been worse? The fact is, we all failed after 2014 to take a meaningful response. And I think that weakness in 2014 was a significant factor in Russian decision-making, that if they tried it again in Ukraine, they'd get the same response. Deterrence requires thinking about the strategy. It's not simply putting weapons into the hands of a potential target. It's a much more important question. And I think as we see China emerging as a threat in the nuclear field as well as conventional, that we need to do a lot more conceptual thinking in the West about deterrence. We did a lot in the 1950s and 1960s. Fortunately, it worked. There was no exchange of nuclear weapons. We're in a different tripartite nuclear world now, and China's a major conventional force too. So this has gotten more complicated. I think we've got to put behind us what we thought when the Soviet Union fell, that history had ended. History has not ended, and it's very threatening to us.
Sounds like you're leaning towards the idea that NATO is brain dead.
Well, I think it's gone quiet for too long, and the invasion of Ukraine, which is a tragedy for Ukraine, ought to be a wake-up call to the rest of us. I think NATO's response has been good, but a lot less than what it needs to be. And so this is a time really to have a broader discussion about what are the threats we're facing. It's not simply the threat of Russia. That threat is blunted in Ukraine. It has not been defeated, but its performance has been less than menacing. It's really the China-Russia axis, which is what I think it's becoming, with outriders like Iran and North Korea. Look at a map, look at the geography. This is something we've got to take seriously.
Now, you've dealt with Putin directly. I'm interested in your assessment of him. If we accept that he's been acting rationally, his version of rationally up to now, is there room left for that rationality? Or what does that look like going forward from now?
Well, I think Putin might actually welcome what Xi Jinping is doing with the so-called peace plan, which is very tilted toward Russia. I think Putin could use a reprieve from this conflict to regroup, restock, re-equip, retrain his forces. But I think Putin, people have tried to psychoanalyze him and say that he's sort of lost the plan. I think he just has a different logic. I recall he has said several times to me after we've debated some arms control issue, well, you have your logic, we have ours, we'll see who prevails. For Russia, and it's not just Putin, it's many Russians, Ukraine is part of the Russian Empire, not even the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire. They believe the Soviet Union was illegitimately ripped apart by the U.S. and the West as a whole, and they aim to put it together. They place a very high value on that. They place a lower value on human life than we do. We don't agree with that approach, but that's their logic, and it's not the same as ours.
Now, you served as the 25th United States ambassador to the United Nations, 2005-2006. How would you rate the UN's response to the invasion?
Well, there essentially is no response. There's certainly been humanitarian work, and I think we all support that. But the political decision-making bodies of the UN are broken and have been for some time. And in particular, the Security Council is broken. You've got two permanent members, Russia and China, who have interest antithetical to the other three permanent members, France, Britain, and the U.S. As we had gridlock during the Cold War when the Security Council was mostly irrelevant, I think we're in the same kind of period going forward. So the idea that the UN, as the League of Nations before it, is an answer to threats to peace and security, I think has been clearly answered in the negative.
Looking a bit more domestically, you've said Donald Trump is, and I quote, the Democratic Party's best asset, will almost guarantee a Democratic win, and Democrats want to see him nominated as the Republican nominee. How can you be so certain? Because he did surprise the world before.
Well, I'm saying from the Democrats' point of view, they'd rather run against Trump than almost anybody else. That's not to say they would win. They may well be overconfident. That's why I'm worried, and I think it's legitimate to worry, that if Trump is indicted, whether it's on the Stormy Daniels matter or any other criminal investigations ongoing, if he's indicted but not convicted, that will be rocket fuel to his campaign. And I am worried about that. I do not want to see Donald Trump as the Republican nominee, not just for the good of the Republican Party, but for the good of the country.
And if there is trouble today in New York regarding the possible arrest of Donald Trump over the Stormy Daniels affair, how much responsibility would you put at the feet of Mr. Trump?
Well, I think he has learned the lesson of January the 6th, and he's calling people into the streets. What the response will be, I don't know. I think at least some Republican leaders have said people should not demonstrate in his favor, and I think that's a step forward. But Trump has literally no limits on what he's capable of doing, and I think we need to be very wary about that. The Republican Party has to cleanse itself of what the damage Trump has done to it. And this is really our responsibility. It's not going to come from the liberal media. It's not going to come from the Democrats. Republicans have to do this, and this is the moment we need to rise to.
And on your own ambitions here, you've not yet declared whether you'll stand in the general election 2024. How damaging do you think it might be, your service in the Trump administration as the National Security Advisor? How potentially damaging do you think that could be if you do decide to run?
Well, I don't think it would be damaging. I mean, I wrote a 500-page book to explain what happened during my time in the administration. I've made my views on Trump clear. I'm still in the consideration stage. I'm not going to run unless I think I've got a chance to win, and it's a very serious decision. But I think the danger of a Trump nomination needs to call forth extra effort from all of us, and that's what I'm looking at.
Just to finish, if we may, by going back to Ukraine, what do you say to those people that say there's a moral equivalence between the West's intervention in Iraq 20 years ago this week and Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine?
There's no moral equivalence at all. Whether you agree with the Iraq decision or not, it was based on the belief that Saddam Hussein was a threat to international peace and security. He had invaded Kuwait 10 years before. He had used chemical weapons against the Kurds, his own fellow citizens. He was perfectly capable of getting weapons of mass destruction and giving them to terrorists. It was to remove a threat to peace and security in the region and globally that we made the decision we did. As I say, you can agree or disagree with it, but the motives were proper. Vladimir Putin's motives were simply recreation of the Russian Empire after his predecessor, the only democratically elected president in the history of Russia, signed an agreement that the Soviet Union would break up along the lines of the Republic borders. And that is what Vladimir Putin is challenging.
And finally, are we already in Cold War II, and how does this war end?
Well, I think it's still in its early stages, but one thing I think that's important about Xi Jinping's effort to form a really strong alliance with Russia is that China today is a Marxist country. There was a period when Deng Xiaoping began his economic reforms, you could say, was still authoritarian, but it was moving away from Marxism. That began to change, and under Xi Jinping, it's clear this is a Marxist government. It's not the Marxism of the 20th century, but it's Marxist in its orientation and authoritarian. That means inevitably, if it continues in this direction, that it will be a Cold War.
And how does the war end?
Well, I think it could be a long struggle. I think for the U.S. and the West as a whole, China is the existential threat. It's not just a threat in Asia. I think that's important for people to understand. It's a threat in the Middle East. We've just seen it manifested in the deal it's brokered between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And it's a threat in Europe, as we see from its support for Russia's position. So people need to think beyond the end of history, which turns out not to be right, and to think what we're going to do to enhance our collective security.
Mr. Bolton, thanks very much for your time with the Telegraph.
Glad to be with you.
Thank you.